Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Healthy Innovators Live TV. My name is Barry Shrier. I'm the founder of GIANT Health, and we're producing for you a weekly series of TV shows where we're bringing together leading healthcare innovators and people developing amazing, interesting new technologies to help the healthcare world. Our vision is to improve the health and the well-being of people around the world by facilitating the adoption of new healthcare technologies and supporting health tech entrepreneurs. These episodes, Healthy Innovators Live TV, are brought to you by GIANT Health. GIANT is an acronym which stands for Global Innovation and New Technology. We are a 7-year-old organization, and we're a global community of nearly 200,000 people. And our strapline is, GIANT is for everybody whose business is healthcare innovation. So what we're doing is we're trying to collect the leading influencers and innovators to share with you their challenges, to share with you their successes, and to help everybody working in healthcare realize how valuable it is to accelerate the adoption of new technology, to in order all of us to deliver better healthcare outcomes at lower cost. So today I'm very proud to introduce you to two really interesting members of the GIANT Health community, coming to you all the way from California. So hello, Gary. How are you today?
Doing well, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. This is Gary Dickinson, who's principal from EHR Standards Consulting. And we also have David Kuraguntla, who is founder and CEO of Alio. Hello, David. How are you today?
Doing great, Barry. Thank you for the opportunity.
It's a pleasure. Really glad to have you guys on board. So, Gary, to begin with, can you tell us from your perspective and your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges in healthcare right now? What are some of the main things we need to strive to address?
Well, that is a very good question. And of course, my focus has been on standards, particularly standards relating to EHR system functionality. That's kind of been my specialty over a number of years.
Excellent.
Been a member of HL7 for about 31 years,
okay.
going back a long ways in that sense. And I think our challenge, as it turns out, is in terms of EHR system adoption and whether we are actually satisfying the important needs of our end users, particularly clinicians, as they engage in direct patient care activities.
Yes. So, Gary, if you could elaborate on that just a little bit. And a lot of our audience, obviously, are professional clinicians, healthcare providers, and people whose careers are in healthcare and technology. But let's also help some of our listeners who don't necessarily have a professional background in this. So, number one, can you help us to understand what are EHR? And number two, what are issues regarding standards? Why are standards important? What's the problem?
Okay, well, EHRs are the term that we use generally for electronic health records. And they can be electronic health record systems,
right?
But they can also include a number of other systems that are tied into the health and healthcare infrastructure.
Okay.
From that standpoint.
Yes.
But I think our real challenge, and maybe this is primarily a U.S. perspective, although I do work with the International Standards Organization as well.
Right.
We do get indications that there are concerns around the world from a number of other countries in terms of how clinicians regard their electronic health record systems.
Okay.
For example, there was a Deloitte survey recently that said 7 out of 10 physicians think that EHR systems reduce their productivity. And
wow.
That's a very serious concern.
Yes, that's quite profound, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And there's another survey in 2018 from the Stanford Medicine Harris Polling Group, who surveyed, I don't know the actual number, but they said 7 out of 10 physicians agree that electronic health record systems greatly contribute to physician burnout. And that has become a significant, I mean, even before COVID and the challenges we now face with that pandemic,
yes,
there is a significant issue around clinician burden, and in many cases, or in a number of cases anyway, resulting in burnout, where clinicians are basically deciding that they want to change their career choices, do something else
Right.
rather than frontline patient care. And it looks like electronic health record systems have at least contributed maybe fairly substantially to that challenge.
Yeah. Well, Gary, that's very interesting. Thank you for introducing these subjects. And throughout this program, I look forward to learning more about that and hearing about what some of the proposed solutions to these challenges are. And Dave, hello. Really glad to have you on board today. Tell us from your perspective, what are examples of a big challenge in healthcare? And what are you guys doing to address that challenge?
Absolutely. I think, as Gary kind of mentioned, is COVID has really spurred, I think, that adoption, especially in our arena for remote monitoring and wearables,
Right.
to bring more data to the market and be able to provide those insights. I think
Yes.
the approach that we've taken at Alio is on chronic disease remote monitoring.
Okay.
Being very disease specific, I think that's provided us an opportunity to present data to a clinician that really matters to them. And we've taken the time to focus on an area of medicine in our particular field where we're starting, which is dialysis. There's a very clear international framework for when metrics that you may want to monitor are outside of the norm and need to be intervened on. And I think that's been really helpful in terms of defining alerts and arenas where people are already notified in a rather clunky system today that can potentially be streamlined either through an EHR or whether through a portal, whatever it might be. There's a good way to get that data in an alert to prevent that physician burnout that Gary was just talking about, because people know what to do with that clinical workflow. I think the big struggle, I think, on the remote monitoring and wearable side becomes the integration side. Where do you start? Who are your partners? How do you get data in front of people? You can do a lot of the clinical work and showcase value, but then actually going into that commercialization step, I think that EHR integration is still a big hurdle to cross, and certainly one that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out over the course of the year.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's extremely interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Can you elaborate on remote monitoring? What are practical examples of that to help our audience understand exactly what you guys are doing and where this fits in the broader healthcare ecosystem?
So Alio is an end-to-end remote monitoring platform. We start off with a wearable that's worn, like I mentioned, for chronic diseases. So dialysis and heart failure, where we start. There's like what we call the smart patch. It looks like a Band-Aid. There's about 16 sensors inside of it that's collecting data all the time. And being able to then, whenever we get close to our hub, which is cellular enabled, it pulls that data up to the cloud. We then analyze that raw data with our proprietary algorithms. And as I mentioned, if there's an alert, it then pushes out that alert off to either into our portal or eventually the EHR for the clinician to then act upon.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. Thank you. You're talking about the integration with EHRs. Is that a pretty straightforward exercise for you guys as a participant in, what do you want to call it, a broader EHR environment?
I'd say it's actually pretty, it can be pretty complex, I think, in many ways. I know there's companies out there that certainly are aiming to help make that integration better for companies like ours. I think questions around who owns the data and data standards certainly come into play. And wanting to be able to always do the best for the patient and be able to ensure timely insights and being able to continually analyze that raw data and push to the next metric that might impact their life. And I think that's a really tough question. I think we're seeing also some different standards on privacy that you kind of have to pass as a gauntlet, and that certainly adds a layer of regulatory framework to companies that already have to deal with, especially for like us on the hardware side, and you already have to deal with a layer of regulatory framework, whether it be the FDA in the US or CE in the EU to deal with as well. So it does add a layer of complexity to the effort.
Gary, why is this so complicated? Why is it that we have these EHR platforms that clinicians are uncomfortable with, and that, according to the analysis you cited earlier, are directly contributing to doctor burnout? Why doesn't Dave say, wow, one of the biggest joys in my business is the little task of integrating what I'm doing with the EHR platforms out there? What's the origin of this, Gary? And how do we address this? What do you, does this fall into your wheelhouse?
Well, it is one of the things we're studying. I am leader of a project team at HL7, Health Level 7, which is looking at clinician burnout
Okay.
and burden as well, in the context of, what is the extent and impact of burden.
Okay.
And we've broken it down into actually 37 different buckets, if you will,
Wow.
that try to capture the essence of what is causing burnout,
Right.
and what are clinicians carrying as far as the burden is concerned.
Yes.
But data is a big part of it, and the challenge with data is that healthcare data is very complex.
Okay.
And it's a challenge of getting that data from the source, and from the source in the form that it was intended by the source, whether the source be an automated device or whether the source be a clinician who is capturing information in the course of their care activities,
I understand.
and ensuring that information is appropriately captured with appropriate provenance, with appropriate context, and retained in the system, the originating system,
Yes.
in a form, in the appropriate form, and then as we communicate it across exchange interfaces between systems, devices,
Okay.
and systems and systems and systems and so forth, that we are preserving the provenance, the context, and the intent of the author, or the intent of the source, if you will, in a manner so that when it is processed across that interface, recognizing that the source system transforms that typically into exchange artifacts such as messages,
Right.
such as documents, and
Right.
such as what we now call FHIR resources, that is preserved across that exchange on the transmitting side, on the receiving side, how it's retained in the receiving system, and then how it may be presented to the ultimate end user or particular end use.
I see.
And that's part of our challenge, is ensuring and preserving that, so that the originating source, author, clinician, or device or source actually could see it on the other side and say, yeah, that's what I captured, that's what I intended, and it has retained its full context and so forth.
Yes.
Many times that is not what is happening.
Okay.
And so I think that's one of the big challenges, is that end-to-end trust and end-to-end data management that we are lacking, or that we have serious challenges with. Should I say it that way?
Yes.
Yeah.
Does that overlap with your world, Dave? And are you involved in these challenges that Gary just mentioned, or is that, how do you say it, in the hands of the EHR platform providers, and you just have to make do with what's given to you?
So I think one of the big questions, as a remote monitoring platform, we always talk about the bits and the bytes in the middle. They'll work. It's the people at either end that you have to worry about, right? So how do you ensure high levels of patient compliance? How also do you ensure high levels of physician or clinician compliance? Because
Right.
if they're not looking at the data, if they're not paying attention to it, if they're not looking at the alert, it doesn't integrate well with their clinical workflow, then everything they're doing is pointless. And I think that question around standards is certainly very valuable. I think trying to create the work that the HL7 and kind of the FHIR standard, how that's come together, I think is certainly very valuable. But I think the actual implementation part and the burden of that implementation still lies very often, I think, with the startup. And as you're trying to break in, and as I mentioned, kind of have a choice of working with a couple limited providers on the EHR interoperability side, and then trying to figure out where your data is going, and kind of losing a little bit of that touch with the customer and having to fit into their framework, or you have to kind of go build it on your own. And I think that, like I mentioned, adds from a HIPAA protection standpoint, and having to meet some of either the SOC 2 or high trust standards and maintain those, or others that are allowing you to do individual testing institution by institution. It's certainly a level of burden that exists, and you have to make a decision, and that's a little bit of a tough place to be, I think, as a startup.
Sure. Understood. How long has your business been going, Dave?
So we actually started off making smart stents almost 8 years ago now, and we actually pivoted to the wearables market as a way to actually get to market fast about late 2016. It's been just about a little over 4 years that we've really been doing the work on chronic care remote monitoring.
Oh, okay. Excellent. And Gary, from your perspective, with regard to people like David and their experience, startups and early stage healthcare tech businesses that are if you will, at the leading edge of innovation and clinician and patient-facing technologies, are you also involved in these themes of what is required for the EHR businesses to make themselves available and accessible to all of these other businesses in the ecosystem?
Well, that is certainly another challenge. I've been involved in about 3 different startups through my career.
Oh, cool.
And so I have in the healthcare space. So I have some knowledge and sympathy, if you will, with those challenges.
Yes.
How do you come up with a viable product and have adequate investment to be able to develop it and sustain it, get it into the marketplace and sustain it that way. And part of our challenge, I think, is that we have, and again, this is my particular area of interest and focus, is in the area of functionality.
Okay.
And more recently in the area of EHR system functionality, because we started this journey, at least at HL7 in 2003.
Oh,
This was actually before some of the government agencies were in place, such as the Office of National Coordinator was not yet in place at that point. But we drew from a broad variety of stakeholders in our standards development process, and including government, of course, but
Yep.
providers and payors and a broad range of stakeholders. And they helped guide our efforts. We couldn't do it just as standards developers sitting in a room as
No.
in an academic sense. It had to be reaching out to the user community and getting good and solid input from them.
Mhm.
And that includes both U.S. and international participants, of course, to get that broad perspective. But then what happened in 2009 was the advent of or the legislation anyway that brought us the meaningful use program, and
Yeah.
essentially the government came down in a top-down and created rules describing the functionality of EHR systems, and they essentially
Right.
discarded all of the work that had been done up to that point. And it was a top-down effort from the government that did not include those stakeholders. Essentially, this is what the government wants your EHR system to produce.
Okay.
And so all of a sudden the focus changed because in order for this program to promote adoption of EHR systems, of course, the systems had to conform with what the government regulations were and had to be certified
Of course.
accordingly.
Yeah.
But without that end user and clinician input, that program produced EHR systems, in my opinion, that no longer well served the needs of the end users.
No.
And that's been part of our challenge, breaking out of that. I think we're beginning to break out of it again, but that has been our challenge for, say, the last 10 years in the U.S.
Sure. No, I understand that, and I can see that as an extremely big challenge. I wasn't aware of the detail of that and the history that you just mentioned, which is very insightful. It reminds me, there's that famous joke, isn't there, where you're on holiday and you're in the middle of nowhere and you drive by somewhere and you're completely lost and you pull up to the side of the road and you ask a local, how do I get from where I am to this destination that I'm wanting to get to? And the local says, well, I wouldn't start from here. And so I'm only wondering out loud, is that resonating with you, Gary? And is there any movement to start over again, or is the system way, way, way too complex to do something like that?
Well, given the fact that the EHR adoption, due to the government incentives, essentially regulations, we have now adoption within hospital systems has now is over 95%, and
Okay.
within private, within the broader clinical practice,
Yeah.
is approaching 90%. We've successfully adopted EHR systems. Now, how do we make them work? so that
Okay.
they are useful to the end user.
Sure.
And I think that's now the next wave of the big hurdle is how do we get from where we are, where we have a somewhat constrained system or artificially constrained system in my mind.
Yes.
And how do we break out of that and really address the concerns that are now being raised by the users and the impact of the burden and the burnout that we just can't ignore. I think it's very clear that has to be addressed in a reasonable and appropriate and very timely manner.
Yes, absolutely. That sounds like quite a profound issue, which I wasn't that aware of, and very interesting to hear about that. So, Dave, Gary just mentioned adoption and the situation which, Gary, I wasn't aware of that EHR adoption was that high, and of course that is very good news. I thought we were past that, but that's simply an expression of my lack of understanding of where we are. So, Dave, for you, what are some challenges regarding adoption, and how are you addressing those? Is this a straightforward product or software service that you're trying to sell, and how does adoption happen? If you can help us to understand some of your business challenges.
Sure, absolutely. So from our end, we really focus on the problem that exists today, and the
Okay.
problem for dialysis patients is that it's a chronic condition, and they have to be monitored. There's kind of three big issues that put them into a hospital. One is that their vascular access has to stay open so they can get their treatment, which is really important. And 1 in 4 are going to have a problem with that in any given year. So they're monitored through typically a radiologist or some other imaging facility will monitor them about once a quarter.
Right.
You've also got the fact that they are likely to be hospitalized for heart failure, so fluid overload is an issue.
Oh dear.
They are going to be monitored through a blood draw, often once a month. And then they're often very much at risk because of the fact that their kidneys aren't functioning. Their electrolyte imbalance, especially potassium, is at risk,
Yep.
which means that they're going to have a risk for arrhythmia. So we're all wearing Apple Watches looking at our heart rate these days. And so this is obviously a very big problem.
Yes.
But as you might imagine, currently today, those are 3 completely different data streams coming from 3 completely different arenas.
Okay.
That are then either being faxed in and then being manually entered to the EHR after a fax has been received from a lab that's taking the blood draw or processing the reading, or an imaging facility that's tackling the diagnostic for whether or not the access is open.
Yes.
So our challenge has been we're getting all of that data in one single device. It's one pipe. And so from the adoption standpoint of the ease of use, the ability to drive alerts, and the fact that the clinical workflow stays the same, those are all very key insights in driving adoption. So we're actually, I think, spoiled for choice in terms of people wanting to leverage the product and utilize it.
Right.
What is the part of the two of the things that we have to tackle is obviously the FDA cycle, which we're going through. We have some of our metrics are commercially available today, but then we're adding on others that needed a little bit more work, as you might imagine, because of their complexity. But the other side of that at the same time is, when do you start to take on that risk of the full EHR integration as opposed to using your portal, which we've developed internally, obviously, to be able to have that data available to the clinician? So it's a little bit of a stepping stone. For clinical, it was much easier to have a portal as we were in that phase. As we transition over into the EHR, we've certainly tried to pick customers and partners who are very, I will say, open to that those stepping stone processes and the challenges that are there for a startup to go through as you make that transition from clinical to commercial and are willing to work. I think it's really important to find.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you for elaborating on that. So we've got about 5-6 minutes left. And so we just want to summarize on some of the priorities that you guys are involved in. And obviously, we're quite keen to help you guys share your businesses and your organization's challenges and opportunities with our listeners around the world. We are, as you know, GIANT Health, a community of nearly 200,000 people around the world. Our aim is for between 55 and 75,000 people to be viewing this episode every week. It also becomes a permanent record on the GIANT YouTube channel and on our website. So very keen to collaborate and to build discussions between the leading innovators like you guys and the greater healthcare innovation community. So Gary, as an example, could you elaborate a little more about your organization and your job, and what are some of your big goals for this year? Do you have any asks? Are you guys looking to recruit more members or raise money, or do you have job vacancies you want to talk about, or what are some big things you're looking to accomplish this year, and who would that be with?
Well, we have. I'm involved in a small consultancy, so we don't necessarily have those big ambitions. I guess I'm later in my career and have kind of settled into a niche. Maybe that's the way to think about it.
No, that's excellent.
But I continue to be involved, of course, in standards development and really wanting to ensure that we get input from the user community. I mean, that's crucial, particularly
Yes.
in user communities. So as I mentioned, we have this project on reducing clinician burden. It's an input process. We want to understand it.
Okay.
So that when we go to our next phase of standards development, which is focused on EHR system functionality, which directly, in many cases, is directly focused on the user, the end user,
Yeah.
and also the patient as well. And we want to ensure that we have considered the challenges that they face in using existing technology and how we can improve that, or how we can at least make recommendations
Sure.
in that regard. And
Yes.
so if I had an appeal, that would be my appeal. We are a standards development organization in HL7. We are open, we are collaborative. We go through a consensus ballot process. So we try not to constrain our specifications to a single opinion. We want to get diverse opinions. And so that would be my appeal, is to reach out to the community and say, please be aware of what we're doing. Give us your input. Join us if you have, if you can, in either in our teleconferences, which we do routinely on a weekly basis, basically. And hopefully we'll be back to face-to-face meetings before too long.
Of course.
And join us in those venues as well.
Sure. Well, Gary, thank you for that. What would be an example of the people in the community? Are these doctors working in primary care? Are these specialist clinicians in hospital? And how do they make contact with you?
Okay, well, this would be anyone who's an end user of health information technology, who thinks about it, who cares about it, who sees that there are things that could be improved. From that standpoint, hl7.org is the primary place to go for HL7 activities. We have a Reducing Clinician Burden project, as I mentioned, under the EHR work group at HL7, so you're welcome. That would also be available through that mechanism. And that's where I would suggest people take an interest and become involved and give us your input. We need it.
Excellent. So that would be clinicians, obviously. That would be doctors. That would be what else? Would that be nurses, hospital management? Would that be paramedics?
The whole range of individuals who have some touch point with health information technology, and that would include patients and patient representatives as well. Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, that's helpful. We engage quite extensively around the world with large patient organizations. And so we'd be very happy to figure out what we could do to connect them to you guys.
Great. Thank you.
And Dave, likewise, tell us a little bit about your goals for this year, and what are you aiming to achieve, and who in our community would you like to engage with? What can the GIANT Health community do to support you guys?
Absolutely. So Alio is making that transition from clinical to commercial this year. So we're certainly looking to expand our team. So from engineering to clinical to also just folks that have managed that transition into the hospital. Certainly something that we're looking to add to the team. I think we'll add quite a few folks this year. I think also from that standpoint, in terms of the community, being able to engage with those who've gone through this process before, whether it's companies that are working with efficient ways to work with startups that have proprietary data sets, is certainly very valuable. But also other remote monitoring companies, learning best practices, trying to simplify some of the challenges that we've had to work through. I think just like we've seen at kind of that EHR level and Fire HL7 level, I think also at the how do we get data, what data is interesting, and where does it get to, and how does it even get into a position to be sent to the clinician. I think learning from that community is certainly valuable, and doesn't have as much of an effort. I think Gary mentioned they've been working on this since 2003. I think there's not as much of that in the remote monitoring role.
Right.
And certainly last but not least is on the clinical front. I think being able to engage with clinicians and communities that are looking for metrics that we can provide in terms of pushing past your basic vitals monitoring into things that I mentioned in terms of being able to monitor blood flow or potassium, or being able to monitor the fluid status of a patient. If you're focused on that chronic care cardiovascular monitoring, we certainly want to hear from you, learn how the product can be beneficial to your patient base, but also to you as a clinician and in your practice. So I think being able to engage with multiple levels of the community is certainly why we're excited to be a part of GIANT.
Excellent. Now, Dave, thank you very much. Do you guys have a geographic focus with regard to the community that you're looking to engage with, the various people in the healthcare innovation ecosystem and so forth that you just mentioned? Are you focusing on, for example, a specific geography right now?
So kind of for us, our top four have been the US. We've also been doing a lot of work in the UK, but also Germany and Japan. So those are kind of our top four where we spent a lot of time. We've actually been working with one of the AHSNs in the northern part of the UK there to help us get the product integrated, do some clinical work, and learn a lot of value. So it's been very, I've spent a lot of time up both in London and in kind of the northern part of towards Newcastle as well over the past couple of years. And it's been great to have that opportunity to see the differences in terms of how people are approaching the product, but also some of the challenges as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. We're running a new series of events in May. I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. It's GIANT Health's European Health Tech Innovation Week from the 17th to the 21st of May. So that's 5 events, 5 one-day events all across Europe. And that includes Barcelona, Berlin, Paris, Stockholm, and Liverpool in the north of England. And so this is showcasing a lot of the best innovation, both from those regions as well as from around the world. So Dave, we certainly would love to invite you to participate in that. And likewise for you, Gary, do you guys have a geographic focus in your work? Are you solely working on issues relating to EHR and so forth in the US, or do you have a broader area of engagement?
Well, through the HL7 organization, of course, HL7 is an international organization. I believe they have 40 plus countries that are actively engaged, affiliates, if you will.
Nice.
And I also work with ISO TC215, which is focused on health informatics. And I believe there's about 35 national member bodies from around the world engaged there. So we do have a lot of international engagement in that sense, and I think that helps immensely in terms of our understanding of needs beyond just our local corner of the world.
Yes, exactly. Okay, well, that's helpful. Hey, look, you guys, I'm so sorry, but unfortunately we've run out of time, which is a shame because I think we could absolutely quite easily talk about all these fascinating and important subjects in healthcare for hours and hours. But on behalf of everybody at the GIANT Health team, David and Gary, I'd like to thank you guys for your time. We love what you're doing. Do please keep in touch with us. We're quite keen to support you guys. And as you know, we have a lot of important big national and international sponsors, including, for example, Barclays Bank, Eagle Labs, and including Vodafone for Business. So we're engaging with a lot of big national and international companies. And through those sponsors, I'm sure they'd love to hear more about what you guys are doing. And if you feel like any of the organizations like that can support you, do please let us know. So we'll make sure we include details about you guys, your biographies, your contact details in the footnotes to this episode. And very keen to keep in touch with you. Obviously, Gary and Dave, thank you for your time. And good luck with your important initiatives. Very, very glad to have you on board this week's episode of Healthy Innovators Live TV. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Barry.